All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining the Bhagyan podcast. As you all know very well, that here we connect with CISOs, security engineers, and overall leaders in the cybersecurity industry, understand from their experiences, their learnings, and try to see how we can implement them in our own life and become better security engineers, maybe move into security leadership. Today we have Hilal from Razorpay, who's the CISO of Razorpay with us today. And he's here to talk about his experiences with the Bhagyan community. Hilal, our team involves mostly security engineers, young students who are very excited about cybersecurity, as well as leaders in the security space who really look up to you. So would love it if you can, maybe give up a small introduction.
Thank you, Dhruv. Happy to be here. Right. Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm working in Razorpay as a Chief Information Security Officer, right? And before this, I used to work for Dream 11 as a Senior Vice President. So I have an accumulated experience of more than 16 years, and all of this experience has been in security, in different kinds of roles, right? So I started as a network security engineer, then went on to become an application security engineer, then became a developer at one point of my career, then became an architect developing security products. Then eventually went into becoming a CISO. That was by accident. Then of course, I have been in the CISO role for I think around 7 years now.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Hilal, and it's a pleasure having you here. I think the way you described your journey till now, right, has been going through every technical role in existence. Right? So many engineers and many security engineers and many people feel that often leaders at the top do not have an understanding of how it's done from the bottom. Right. So you have gone through a cycle in life which has been from a security engineer to an application security engineer, even software engineering to an SVP to now a CISO at Razorpay. How do you think you have personally seen yourself develop across these different kinds of job roles to now a leadership job role? And if you can take that.
Sure. So I think one of the conscious decisions that I made very early in my career was basically to diversify my experience, right? So if you look at my career, I have not worked the same kind of industry twice. It was always I went from basically one industry that was actually completely focused on building enterprise level products to a services company to basically a gaming industry to travel industry to now at a fintech, right? So I have had this diversified experience, and each of these experiences actually taught me a lot, right? So at every place, I learned different aspects of security and different types of requirements that actually come as part of the baggage, as a part of doing business, right? So when I started as a network engineer, it fascinated me, so how actually things communicate, right? How to make sure that nobody is eavesdropping and things like that, right? So you want to make sure that, okay, your network is free from any kind of interferences and things like that, malicious or otherwise, right? So even if at those days, even if the network was unavailable, maybe not due to security, but it was still blamed on you, right? So you needed to know exactly what you are dealing with. So it taught me about learning the fundamentals first. So I put a lot of emphasis on learning the fundamentals. So even now I remember basically typing on the black consoles, the commands on configuring the routing protocols, configuring the virtual LANs, configuring all those things, right? So that was a fascinating time. And then eventually what happened was that it also allowed me to basically understand how these things actually work in a larger space, right? So then of course network does not actually provide business on its own, right? So it has to connect to applications, it has to connect to services, it has to basically connect to other infrastructure. So eventually what happened was I actually sort of went into understanding how the interaction happens, how the ecosystem actually works. Then I realized that, okay, it's not just networking that makes you a good professional, security professional. So you have to learn the things that are actually working with it. So each of these places has taught me something that I did not learn from before. right? As an engineer or as an application security engineer or a developer, as an individual contributor, you have different kinds of responsibilities, which is actually delivering the best quality product, best quality software to customers, right? But when you come into a leadership role, not only have to deliver actually good quality products, but you also have to take care of the business functions. You have to basically take care of your people. You have to take care of your strategies and things like that. So that brings its own lessons, right? So earlier I used to be like all about basically like technical things, right? So now what I have learned is that that's really one part of it, right? So there's another significant aspect of it is like soft skills. You need to have a good pleasing way of talking. You need to make sure that other people understand what you're talking about, right? So and have endless patience, right? So I got to understand that from being in the leadership positions, right? So yeah, so I think that was kind of like my learnings across the different industries and across different roles that I had.
I think, Hilal, what you said about diversifying experiences is something that many people will actually connect with.
Right,
Because as you can imagine, being a security engineer, I have personally seen many of my colleagues, many bounty hunters on BugBase, as well as, many people on our community who the way that they were able to learn cybersecurity or got intrigued by cybersecurity was the fact that they have such a diverse experience in everything,
right,
that they can understand, those kinds of things. And you're completely correct with regards to soft skills. Many security engineers I've seen, even bug bounty hunters who have earned bounties at the scale of $50,000 from companies like PayPal and large platforms, still do not have the soft skills required to actually have a business role or that kind of a thing. So it's often we recommend in the community that you should always build your own brand as well,
absolutely.
right? As a security engineer. So moving on to the next question, Hilal. I feel like the Indian cybersecurity landscape is something that is, the talk of the hour right now, right? With regards to, of course, the significant number of ethical hackers out here, um, and with regards to, of course, the growing importance of cybersecurity in India with the personal data protection bill, which just got passed in Lok Sabha yesterday. What is your opinion on the Indian security landscape? How it's different from others? Do you think the Indian security landscape has the ability to, show strength much better than something like an Israeli, an American, or Russian kind of a landscape, wherein they look at security in the seriousness they do.
See, so to begin with, right? So I totally believe that we have phenomenal talent in India. Right? There are no two questions about it, right? So what happens is that there's always this aspect of like uh, making sure that okay, you are known in the security industry for some reason, right? So you do bug bounties, you do things like that, where the entry bar is low, right? So normally what happens that you sort of like look towards basically the research that other people have done and leverage that to basically like do your stuff, right? So why I feel like we are like way behind like places like Israel and America, right? Is because we don't have that kind of investment and that kind of research done in India, right? So if we are actually at number 10, right? So in terms of the security maturity as a country. So our India is like number 10 rated number 10. So which is not too bad, right? Out of 195 countries, it's not too bad. But of course, like when you actually think about it, right? So first and second are like America and Israel, and then there's big gap between basically like 3 and basically 10, right? So massive gap. It's because they're like, say for example, like if they're like a startup, like they're like 3,000 startups actually like getting started in Israel, right? So in India, like maybe like 10 to 20 odd startups, which are surviving somehow, right? So basically, it's a David versus Goliath kind of situation, right? So we are in a place where we have the potential, but do not have the investment that's actually required. So I think, and our curriculum that's actually devised in the colleges and universities actually do not necessarily facilitate that. So I think what needs to happen is that we need to basically work on it from ground up to make sure that we actually have a serious basically like consideration for basically building that kind of talent in India and inviting the investments and inviting basically the research that needs to happen. So I totally think that we are capable of doing that, right? So but it's just that basically like we need to get serious about constructing and basically facilitating them to do something that's actually going to be vital in security industry. As far as security hygiene is concerned, right? So obviously we have a long way to go. Like data protection bill actually, like I think is like a good step in that direction. We welcome that, right? So it has been in the works for quite some time, and we were like eagerly waiting for its enforcement. Now that the enforcement has happened, so I could not be more happy, right? But at the same time, what actually happens is that now all the organizations need to basically like stand up and basically take notice of basically what the controls that they need to implement to be in compliance with basically the new data protection bill. In India, particularly, I'm sure that you will agree with me, right? So data privacy is like a very alien kind of subject. So we do not necessarily understand it, to be honest, right? So it's more like we are still struggling to basically strike a balance between data privacy and data usage, right? So unless like we figure that out, I mean, we are always going to be one step behind in actually like in all the security hygiene.
I think that makes total sense, Hilal. With your point for phenomenal talent in India, I think that's something the world has noticed for sure.
Yeah.
Um, but you are, I think, bang on with regards to the fact that investments are there and the fact that, of course, the curriculum doesn't help. I don't think there is any proper program, like educational program in the country that actually promotes cybersecurity in a strong way. Recently, I saw IIT Kanpur launch the Sci-Hub program. But again, that is not a part of the curriculum. That is an accelerator if anybody is kind of interested in it. And the government is funding that. I think this is an opportunity for many private institutions as well to come forward
Right.
further than, faster maybe than government institutions and introduce more security oriented, more hands-on security oriented topics that ethical hackers can use to, of course, get jobs and not be not hireable for a while.
Yeah.
And with regards to inviting investments, I think the Indian people are doing the best they can. I think that on that end we are kind of growing very fast, and you highlighted that with your startup point itself. I've seen that 10 years difference between US and India, but certainly that is something that is going on. And your point regarding CISOs, having to do a bit extra work after this data protection bill is also very interesting, because us as a person leading a security company, we'll feel that this is great, but for a CISO, it's a lot of more work that's coming, right? But
Exactly.
of course, we all understand that the goal of it is to, of course, improve the overall security of a country and of a company, and the fact that security is a journey, not a compliance checklist, is something that should be established a lot more. With regards to that, I wanted to move into one more point, Hilal, which I believe you're very interested and talk a lot about, is the research that is happening in India. Of course, investments will come in, but more often than not, we see that investments are coming in fintech companies mostly,
Right.
right? Because lending is a space, or consumer space companies, basically. If we look at the market for enterprise tech, even if we look at security, right, the max that a company spends on cybersecurity is $1 billion in product and $3 billion in services, right? It's still a very consultancy-led market, that kind of a thing. So how do you think, the students, the researchers, maybe even the CISOs and the leaders watching in our community can look at research and R&D, which often doesn't have a direct business outcome out of it, incorporate that into a part of their lives, look at that a lot more seriously, and for the researchers, not just go to the US?
Yeah, it's a topic that's very close to my heart, right? And it hurts, right? It hurts because, like, if I have to like recollect on top of my head, what is the original research that happened in India, and can I refer to that, right? So you can count it on your fingertips, right? So they're like hardly any, right? So meaning that like there's a significant like gap in terms of basically encouraging people to do basically some research, right? So I think the push needs to come from basically veterans, like who are in the industry and veterans in the government. So they need to push for it, right? So for example, like literally every government has somebody who's like head of R&D, right? So R&D minister or something like that, or some. So we do not have such kind of setup, right? So if you look at basically like the ECCs and all that, which focus more on basically services, right? So every law that you make, which is like IT Act or something like that, right? So every law you make, that's actually focused somehow on basically services, right? So you do not necessarily have that sort of like incentive to basically do a product-based research, right? So in fact, like if you look at basically the environment right now, how many products in India have become like standards in their own basically space? Hardly any, right? So like it's very difficult to understand, like, okay, like if we had something like, let's say, BugBase, for example, we want to make it like a standard in external research, right? But what exactly external research are we talking about? Right? Or just discovering the bugs, getting bounded for that. Like, is that what we are trying to encourage, or are we encouraging people to basically like invest in products, invest in basically something that actually like is a protocol level or is actually at a much baser level? So, which is sort of like an engineering, which earlier there was no such thing as a security as a domain, by the way, right? So when I started, it was a systems engineering domain. The reason it was called systems engineering domain was because like it was supposed to be like an integral part of the research, right? Security was integral part of the research, and that's how the system engineering domain actually came into practice. So that time it was essential for somebody to learn basically how do you do protocol level fuzzing, right? At the same time, how do you basically like disassemble protocols? And so you had to basically make sure that you understand that. Like, but now it has changed, right? So now the focus has moved away from basically engineering to basically operations and execution. Now the faster you can operate and the faster you can execute is actually taken into consideration, and that's where the focus is. So I think it's I mean, like it for an engineering like student, right? So for him to learn something like which is going to be base element for him and may not necessarily be actually available to him at his work, right? Uh, I mean, like say for example, you learn something about a protocol, then you're asked to basically like work on something like an Excel sheet, right? How does that actually work, right? So on a hands-on skill level basis, so it's very important that when we think about it, right? So we have to think about it in a holistic manner. So not only do we need to basically like encourage the research that needs to happen, but also provide opportunities for them to use that research. So people don't find it. There's no incentive for somebody to do research right now. So because it hardly is actually incentivized. So I think one of the reasons areas we can actually solve this for is basically like and concerted effort from the government, particularly from the science and science ministry. I don't know what that's actually called, but whatever it is, like
Mighty Ministry of
the Mighty,
Information
of course, like
Technology.
the Mighty
Yeah.
is a different. Mighty can actually like help in actually getting those programs started. I think
Mhm.
there was a paper that actually they circulated on R&D, but it was just okay, like basically putting the responsibility on the organizations and
Correct. It's just like, yeah, do it if you want to do it. That
exactly.
kind
There's
of
no
a
such incentive that said, okay, let's help you actually doing it. Labs are
thing.
not cheap, resources are not cheap, right? So our quantum computer is actually 5 million, so something like that. And China has
Correct.
like 10 or 20, 25 of them. So how do you actually compare yourself with that? So they did not actually have basically like the organization develop it for them. The government took an
Mhm.
initiative and developed it for them, right? So
Correct.
there's obviously like a need for us to have a much better investment internally for security research projects.
No, I think that makes that vibrates with a lot of people, right? Because because many of them may build out small tools just out of their own interest. But until somebody actually tells them that what you're doing is important and you should continue to keep doing it, they
Absolutely.
will not continue to keep doing it, right? They will kind of go elsewhere, wherein the incentivization is actually there. And I've seen many people kind of stop working on many of the interesting projects that they were working on because there is no incentive for them to kind of work on it. So this is where one place where I feel that open source can be very valuable as well, since
Absolutely.
the community on its own provides the incentive if you're building out something interesting in public. And that has been, you know, one of the best ways I have seen security research happen in India. Wherein you know, you look at Project Discovery and many more, Acto, all these other Indian startups that have recently come up. They have to go global. They have opted for going open source
Yeah.
because they're like, okay, why we can't be the best product in the world because of course we don't have that kind of an investment, but at least we can be open and get feedback from the community, and that is something that has worked out for them.
Yeah.
So what do you think of open source? Do you use open source at Razorpay?
Who does not?
Got
So yeah, so open source plays a very vital role in particularly in security, right? So If I go like 10 years back down the line, right? So you would you would see every security tool actually an open source tool. There are hardly like some vendors who used to provide basically commercial security tools, and those were like endpoint antiviruses or maybe some scanners or things like that. The rest, all the tools were actually open source. And in fact, like if you look at today, like some of the tools like Metasploit or some other tools, right? So they all were open source at one point of time, right? So none of them actually started as a commercial products. In fact, you will actually look at the other like SIEMs and things like that. They all sort of start open source.
Right.
So meaning that like open source plays a very vital role in actual like security. And I could not imagine like things like a MISP or something like that, which we use on a daily basis, right? If they get commercialized, what will they do, right? So they're like SOAR platforms are basically like other analytical, like security analytical platforms, right? All of them used to be open source. In fact, like one of the most popular tools that security professionals use, which is like Nmap. I don't know how long that's going to be open source, but as long as it is, we're enjoying it, right? Burp used to be an open source tool. So not many people know that it was an open source tool. Like so, similarly, what I meant by that is like all of these tools that came from open source like are vital for security. They have helped actually defend against malicious actors for so long, right? So they have helped us
For
actually.
sure. I think the goal is to increase adoption, right, by being open source.
Correct.
These tools are again used by security engineers, which is again a niche in the community, right? Not every developer is a security engineer. So
Correct.
it actually is an incentive for someone to keep it open source. That's
Yeah,
why when, Burp Suite and all these guys went closed source and, put a paywall on it, they always have a community edition in place so that,
right.
that adoption, that, usage still stays.
I feel that they have every right to basically monetize the products because it became so popular, and they also had to pay bills, right? So you can't blame them for it, right? So I think it's a
Exactly.
great strategy. I really appreciate them keeping the community edition still open. So I think no organization can deny the fact that okay, they have got to use open source, and the more thought leadership and the more research that goes into open source products is actually really critical, right? So even I think I'm a big proponent of basically like open source. I think that is the way you get the maximum amount of feedback, as you rightly pointed out. And some other players like Acto, by the way, I'm a big fan of Acto. So
Okay, great.
yeah, so Acto companies like Acto and other people who go open source, right? It's a very commendable and very courageous thing to do, right? So you are exposing a technology that you are going to use, and you are so confident that in its success and its quality that you are willing to get feedback and the validation from your peers, and nothing like that. So
Correct.
that's a massive respect to the teams who are actually doing that. And
Mhm.
they obviously have a fan in me, right? So I totally believe that we should encourage OSS adoption as much as possible, right? And if for my team, for example, right, so they also have this objective of going native as much as they can, right? So which means that we have got to adopt basically open source software as much as we can and develop on that, basically try to basically like use it for our own use cases, and in turn we actually submit that back to the community, okay, what we solved and how somebody else can actually benefit from that. So this is a great
Got it.
strategy. I absolutely believe in that. I think we should encourage more of that.
That's like a very modern way to look at security at a company. So Hilal, getting a bit more into your role as a CISO at Razorpay, right? I think fintech on its own right is I think the biggest thing that's happening right now in India, and Razorpay is practically one of the biggest fintechs in India. So looking at such a large attack surface, looking at so many possible attack vectors externally as well as internally in the company, security at Razorpay must be a very challenging job, right? Which you are leading. So I am very curious to understand for a fintech company, what is it that goes into ensuring that such a large security posture remains in place? Because the fact is, at the end of the day, people will not scrutinize you for the security you put in place. People will scrutinize you for that one thing that goes wrong, right? So how is it that you look at it at Razor?
Yeah, so uh, it's something that like is a natural thing to ask, right? And I'm
Mhm.
sure that like my peers, like who are in the other industries, also has similar kind of challenges, right?
Mhm.
But yeah, at a fintech, I feel it more strongly, right? Because like not only do you do business basically, which is like a core with respect to data security, data privacy, and regulatory requirements from the government agencies and things like that. You're actually bound to that, right? So you can't
Correct.
basically ignore security and compliance, right? So there are like a lot of drivers which actually like ensure that okay, we have the highest level of preparedness and highest level of security in the organization, right?
Mhm.
I'm proud like of the fact that in our company, right? So security and compliance are number one and number two priorities. So meaning that like everything else comes after that. Like you have availability, you have resilience, you have basically like service delivery, whatever it is, right? So incident response, right? So that comes after security and compliance. So the first and second
Yeah.
priorities are always going to be security and compliance. That's how seriously we take it, right? So in with respect to like how do we actually like maintain a strong security posture, right? It comes from a variety of strategies, right? So one is basically making sure that we automate as much as we can, basically remove the dependence on people as much as we can, because if you keep on basically dependence on people, the security is not going to scale, right?
Mhm.
So we put a lot of focus on the hiring the right kind of people, so who are going to take initiatives with respect to automating the security controls and the requirements. We also basically have this concept of basically assuming breach, right? So we assume that we are always breached. So we try to basically like put a lot of focus on detection engineering, threat intelligence, basically like to make sure that our brand is protected, and external attack surface area is actually monitored properly. And then of course like we have like a lot of focus on basically compliance, because you can't get away from compliance, right? So each and every single day like we are under some kind of audit. So streamlining those audits, making sure that we have some kind of consistency and some kind of predictability in our audits, right? It's actually very, very important. So yeah, that's how actually we try to basically like stay ahead of the curve and make sure that we are always prepared for that one breach, right? So we absolutely cannot ignore the fact that at some point there may be some incident that actually we would want
Correct.
to basically catch earlier, right? So in order, so that's why the crisis management comes into picture. The basically making sure that we have controls way beyond a breach, meaning that like even if the data is breached, we have controls in place to make sure that it's not usable data for
Uh,
guard it,
it's
right?
encrypted in some way or it's
Not just
hashed
encryption.
out in some way.
Exactly, encryption is one of the tools and one of the tactics that we use. But apart from that, there's always going to be de-identification of data with respect to anonymization and all that, right?
Anonymization,
So
correct.
yeah, so making sure that okay, even if the breach happens, people cannot benefit from it, right? So
Mhm.
that's
Hilal, what is your opinion on many of these PII, PCI de-anonymization SaaS tools, right? Would would an
it's,
organization that has audited as Razorpay ever opt
yeah.
for that?
It's a slippery slope, right? So
Mhm.
basically, like on one hand, like you're actually saying that I'm going to be anonymizing my data, but then you're
Mhm.
putting an intermediary who does it for you. So the anonymization is
Correct.
lost at that point. What if they get actually compromised? So
Mhm.
it's kind of like this, right? So you may have all the airtight NDAs and airtight agreements with companies to make sure that the data does not get leaked, but you
Mhm.
obviously do not have control on it, right? So once it's
Right.
actually put out of your control, you're no longer basically going to be like aware of what's going on with the data that you're actually going to assess provider. So nothing against them. I'm sure that they work in different use cases, and but for us it does not, because of the obvious reasons. We are a regulated entity, so we cannot share the data
Correct.
with anybody. Forget about sending it to a third party SaaS provider, right? So
Exactly.
yeah, so even internally also, like not everybody can see the data that's they are not supposed to see. So if we had that kind of control within the organization, so obviously we'll have way high controls when the data sharing actually has to happen outside of the organization.
Correct. So, Hilal, two further questions after this, which I'm very curious to understand how it goes on. One is that, of course, when you are such a regulated entity, there are, of course, many controls that are put in place. Like, if you can talk a bit about, what are these entities that put controls in fintech companies, what kinds of controls these are, how do you ensure that these controls are met in time, on time, considering an audit is happening every day?
Right.
And the second question is what I want to ask is that considering everything would be being hosted on cloud, I don't think anybody has a data center nowadays. What do you think of the government's overall adoption of cloud technology, hosting it on the cloud? Is that something that is okay now?
Yeah, so the first question, the entities which are interested in making sure that we are compliant and we have governance in place, right? So obviously, like we have a big brother, right? So which is the RBI,
Mhm.
that will always be there. So then NPCI is one of the organizations, then SEBI, then IRDA, then all of mighty, in fact, like a lot of those basically organizations, right? So those are basically mandated compliance requirements to maintain the licensing and things like that. Like apart from that, then we have basically like integrations with the other vendors, right? So for example, we have MasterCard, we have Visa, we have other people, right? So for them also, there are like a lot of compliance and regulatory requirements. Not regulatory, it is a compliance requirements. And then apart from that, we also have, because we are both tokenization and the card processing entity, right? So we have like other PCI controls, like and other things that we actually have to go through. Apart from that, like so we have self-regulation in with respect to making sure that we actually have a proven kind of security in place, right? So that is assured through ISOs, SOCs,
Mhm.
DPSC, CSFs, and all of those controls, right? So the massive amount of basically like a compliance requirements that we actually have to comply with. So those are the basically the entities that we actually work with respect to regulatory and compliance requirements. With respect to cloud adoption, this is something that's very interesting, right? So
Mhm.
if you look at basically like the way the compliance standards were set up, they were not set up for basically cloud adoption. So most of the controls that still actually
Yeah, exactly.
are basically are, they don't really realize that how a CI/CD pipeline is actually automated, right?
Exactly.
So if, for example, there is no manual intervention actually required for releasing a product, they find this actually an alien concept. Like
Mhm.
how, right? How do you manage the governance? How do you make sure that
Mhm.
the change is actually taken care of? How do you make sure that the release actually happens through different checks and things like that? So when it comes to basically automating all of that, right? So the government actually like the auditors actually find it difficult to basically reconcile that. So then lately what has happened is that we have started basically like modulating our responses according to that. And now instead of actually like making them understand that, right? So we provide them with the artifacts that they can relate with. So for
Mhm.
example, in change management, we have different triggers and different actions that we take within the CI/CD, and then we show it to them, right? So so I hope that they actually like come up warm up to the idea of basically having a cloud native organization doing business. But most of the controls that they actually suggest are for basically like entities or organizations that have their data centers self-hosted, which makes it very difficult for us, right? But at the same time, what we do is basically we tend to basically like mirror our implementation with respect to that of a self-hosted one. So draw a comparison with that, right? So and that actually helps. And the auditor actually see. Then what lately what we have done is basically like we are trying to sort of set up a portal for the auditor so that he can see the evidences or the artifacts that he needs by himself. So we don't have to handhold him. So that way, it actually becomes a lot more efficient, and then we don't have to basically do all the manual things that we used to do in the past.
Got it. No, I think you can even sell that as a product to other CISOs as well. That
Yeah,
can be one interesting thing that
absolutely.
Razorpay can do. And but it's very interesting to kind of hear about this from you because yeah, we have at BugBase, you can imagine how bug bounty can never be deployed on prem, but you would be surprised the people who do ask that question, right? Can you
Yeah,
do a bug bounty on prem? So I'm like, I mean, you can buy my software but there is still a bit of alienness to this concept. I completely understand, and for them the controls are so strict, and they're not able to find a way around it. They're like, okay, no one from won't do it. That kind of a thing is basically in place. And of course, yeah. Please go on. Hilal.
yeah, I think the anxiety comes from the fact that some of the organizations who are particularly in the financial sector, right? So for them, it's like a sky is going to fall down if somebody else knows they have a vulnerability. Or
Mhm.
say, for example, if some data is getting breached and they are not the first ones to know about it. So
Mhm.
I think the anxiety comes from the fact that, okay, they should be the ones to know about it. So it does not get into the media, it does not get into other places where basically people will know about it.
It's very interesting that I was at Nalcon last year, and the Yes Bank CISO, the Tata CISO, and Dr. Sanjay Bell from CERT were having a discussion. And the problem was that CERT is the one who wants information as soon as it's noted. Tata is the one who's developed the software for Yes Bank, right?
Yeah.
So and they're the ones who are hosting it. So when the and Tata and Razorpay have Tata and Yes Bank have an agreement that, of course, whenever an incident is reported, I will report it to you first. So who is the one that actually reports it to CERT? Because Tata has an agreement with these guys, this has an agreement over there. So it just
I
goes
think
all around the place, right?
it's at the end of the day, it's the basically the owner of the asset that gets compromised or that has some kind of a security incident, right? So they are the ones who need to report it. So I think it's that's why the DPO concept is there. Like, so we had data protection officers and things like that.
Exactly.
So that's exactly the reason why it is there, right? So to basically establish the ownership of the incident. So this Yes Bank can basically nominate anybody to be a DPO. They can nominate even TCS or who are basically develop the software to be their DPO, right? So, which means that they are responsible for basically communicating that information to certain, right? So meaning that it's always going to be the data owner or basically the asset owner who's going to be ultimately held responsible for that. So ultimately, what actually is like important is to understand what is the implication of not reporting or maybe like having like ambiguous kind of reporting to CERT, right? It doesn't help anybody. I mean, like, and why would somebody be scared of actually reporting it to CERT, right? So it's more like basically that ambiguity needs to be. I understand like where they're coming from, to be honest, right? So ownership is like very ambiguous, but at the same time, what I think this CERT should do is actually make that actually a little bit more clear, right? So saying that, okay, I take it from basically the digital basically payment security act. Basically, what it does is basically it tells you that why it happened does not matter, why it was reported does not matter, right? What
Just the
matters?
second you see it, you report it.
Yeah, exactly. So,
Correct.
for example, for us also, like, so for example, sometimes what happens there is like some transactions may not go through basically the legal means, right? So they are reported to basically law enforcement agencies and things like that. It takes considerable amount of time basically for the law enforcement agencies to validate whether that report is actually like correct or not. Then they actually send it. In the meantime, 3 to 4 months have passed or 5 months have passed. So it does not actually respect the 6 hours basically like limit that CERT has actually put in. So why would we actually go with that? Right. So at the end of the day, right? So I think as somebody who's going to be accountable for it should be reported, right? So because when it actually goes into the code of law, right? So they are not going to basically like sue basically TCS or anybody else.
Correct.
They're going to sue Yes Bank, right? So because Yes Bank is the one that actually got breached or that got compromised. So they are going to be held accountable for that. And they are the ones who should be reporting it. They can designate whoever they want to delegate it, no problem. But ultimately, if they understand the accountability, nothing better than that.
No, I think if these controls are put in place and, with the personal data protection bill, this is going to be looked at a lot more seriously. It's really going to solve a lot of these problems wherein reporting may not be happening because a person is scared or may not want to report it. Something bad might happen, that kind of a thing. But yeah, what you're saying makes sense. So, Hilal, one more last question that I have. We'll, wrap up on time.
Mhm.
And this is a question that many people have in our community of ethical hackers is that if they eventually want to one day work for you, right, what is it that they should start doing from today? What is it that will get them a job at a company like Razorpay as a security engineer?
Yeah, there are three things actually that are important, right? So one is like have a genuine interest in becoming a good security professional. If you are doing just this because, okay, this is going to get you some money or something like, or this is going to help you basically run your household, right? That's actually good motivation, but you should actually have a very genuine interest in actually becoming a security professional. Otherwise, there are other jobs that can actually provide even better money, right? So, and it's not for the weak of heart, right? So you need to have a very thick skin to be able to still work in this. And there are a lot more rejections, right, than any other field. So don't get disheartened, right? So other thing I think is I think focus a lot on the fundamentals. Like if you're fundamental and right, no matter what you do, like no matter how famous you are not a good security professional, in my opinion. right? So if you don't know, like basically, like say, what is an HTTPS protocol, but you discovered a SQL injection, it doesn't make any sense, right? So you should know exactly what the fundamentals are. So that's actually incredibly important. Third thing I would actually basically like mention is that you should be persistent, right, and consistent in actual like security field, right? So it's not like you're going to be an expert in a couple of years, right? It takes a lot of research, takes a lot of effort. So be persistent and never give up, right? And I think those are the qualities that I would actually assume like should be there in the candidate. And yeah, I think those are the three things I would definitely want in a candidate.
For sure, Hilal. I think everybody hears that loud and clear. Genuine interest in thick skin is extremely important. Fundamentals is, I don't think I can stress the importance of that. I have seen enough security engineers talk about the most complex of topics. And then when I ask them the most simplest of questions, they're like, I'm not sure. They don't know what an API is, right?
Right.
So these kinds of things I have seen happen a lot. And these things are very, very easily avoidable. And that is something people really need to focus on. And your point with regards to persistence, I think that's just the whole security space, right? As I earlier said, it's a journey, not a goal. Um,
Right.
and yeah, for bug bounty, it's always persistence. You have to stay on a target with time. For a job, it's always persistent. So I think this is something that really moves me as well as the overall community. But thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Hilal. We'll wrap it up here. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for giving your thoughts and learnings to the community. And I hope everybody will take something out of it and improve their lives.
Yeah, thanks, Dhruv, for inviting me. This was truly a good interaction, right? I enjoyed myself a lot, right? So thanks so much for that, and I hope that this will be useful if people listen to it.